Welcome. I am Austin Yenne, a member of the Palm Beach Young Democrats and the lead contributor to the group's blog. This is the third in our recent series of recorded interviews. Continuing on our series of interviews, my latest guest is Dayen. He is an independent journalist who contributes to The Intercept, The Nation, In These Times, among many other outlets. David is also the author of the book Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. David was kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule to talk to me about his book and the importance of the CFPB. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. So, what got you into journalism?
So, it was something that really isn't that present today, and that was the political blogosphere. In 2002, 2003, I was working in television, actually, as an editor for television and film, and came across these things called blogs that were just sort of getting some momentum at the time, and decided I was interested in it, started my own in 2004, and kind of took it from there. At the time, if you were a blogger, political blogger in 2004, you were part of a pretty select group. Now, today, you go on Twitter and everyone has an opinion, but there weren't a lot of people doing it back in 2004, 2003, and you had the opportunity to sort of shape your voice and move up through the ranks. And I was fortunate enough to come of age in that time period and was able to do that, and was largely writing about political matters and maybe a little bit of policy, but certainly more around politics until the financial crisis. And I've gone back and looked at my blog the week that Lehman Brothers went under, and I wasn't really writing about that at all at that time. But after the financial crisis happened, I really felt the need to educate myself on the causes and what happened here and how we can prevent it from happening again. And so that really shaped my experience right up until today. I mean, I write about other subjects, but I think that financial matters is something that and particularly housing, is something that I've wanted to cover ever since that moment. And so started writing for a bunch of different blogs, and after the 2012 election, decided to go out on my own as an independent journalist, and I was fortunate to have people who I've met and knew through blogging for several years that were able to recommend me and take me in, and couldn't be more fortunate. I've been able to sort of string together a career.
Speaking of which, you were talking about the collapse of the Lehman Brothers and going back to study, what caused it. What is your view of how did this housing bubble come to be created?
How did it happen?
Yes.
Well, I mean, one thing that's important to recognize is that it didn't happen overnight. Even though if you were doing sort of the statistical analysis, you would say that the housing bubble began in 2003 and lasted until, depending on your timing, the end of 2006 or the beginning of 2007. The structure that was created to enable and facilitate that from happening really goes back 30 years before that. It goes back to the 1970s. It goes back to Salomon Brothers and other big banks on Wall Street who really decided that they wanted to turn mortgages into something they could trade. And they had several obstacles to that. Number one, you had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which at that time controlled the trading, the secondary market for mortgages. They were really the only ones who were authorized to buy mortgages, package them, and resell them. And undoing that and allowing Wall Street a place at that table required several things, several changes to law that had to be done. It wasn't just coming up and making mortgage companies comfortable with selling their positions into investment banks. It was legal trench warfare, really, to get the changes into the law to enable that. And there was a guy named Lou Ranieri who was the head mortgage trader at Salomon Brothers, recounted in famous book, The Liar's Poker by Michael Lewis, who really pioneered this idea of creating these private mortgage securities that could be traded back and forth. And he set about making the changes that needed to be made in the law, going back really all the way to the Carter administration, there was a law in 1980, the last year of the Carter administration, called the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, and that created one of the avenues for mortgage-backed securities to exist. There was another couple during the Reagan administration changing the tax laws so that these investments could be essentially tax exempt, changing the laws so that institutional investors like pension funds would be allowed to purchase these private securities that didn't really have a government guarantee as long as they were highly rated by a credit rating agency. All of these things came together. So you go all the way back to the Carter administration, and there were different laws that were put in place through Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, and Clinton to set the stage for what happened in the second Bush administration. You know, the contribution of George W. Bush was really just regulatory neglect, allowing the bubble to fuel up. And so it really was a concerted effort on behalf of both parties to allow Wall Street to take over this market. And when they did, they created this situation where it was almost a game of hot potato. If you were a mortgage company that wasn't a bank, you could get a warehouse line of credit from an investment bank that was essentially offered to you on the idea that you would fuel them with a steady supply of mortgages, the quality of which were secondary to their existence because they would immediately be sold to the investment bank. The investment bank would package them up into securities, put them into a trust. The trustee would then sell them all around the world, little tranches of them, to institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, you name it, whoever was willing to buy them. And they would each have this little sliver of a mortgage, so they didn't have to know whether some guy in Albuquerque was willing to pay, on their 30-year mortgage. They would just know that they would have a little piece that was so regionally and demographically diverse that the theory went that not all of them could go down at the same time. And so that was what was sold essentially to these investors. They, picked up little slivers here and there, and depending on their position in a hierarchy, they would either get paid first, and then the next tranche would get paid next, and the next tranche would get paid next. You would take on a higher level of risk depending on where you were in that hierarchy, and you would get more interest paid out depending on where you were in that hierarchy. And that was the idea, and ultimately a claim by the geniuses on Wall Street who said there's no way, never in American history has all of these mortgages gone down at the same time. Mortgages are a regional market. Well, that turned out to be completely untrue. And the reason it turned out to be untrue is that underwriting for mortgages became completely almost non-existent after a certain period of time, mainly because the pressure that these mortgage companies were feeling to deliver more and more mortgages up the chain to be sold and made into securities, that you started to see people, particularly in Florida where you are, fail to be able to pay their first payment of mortgages. There's a problem when the first payment can't be made. The rest is kind of history that has unfolded before us. We know that we had close to 10 million families lose their homes as a result. We had this terrible financial crisis that led to years of elevated unemployment. We know who paid the price mostly, and those were people who lost their homes and their jobs. And we know that there was a huge multi-trillion-dollar bailout from different facilities, whether it was the Federal Reserve or Congress authorizing a giant tranche of money that saved the banks but did not save the people who had the mortgages and who had the jobs they ended up losing.
So you cover a large amount of topic. What made you specifically turn to foreclosure fraud into a book?
Sure. So I can pinpoint that very directly for you. I had a friend out here in California who was, someone I knew because my wife was a big Obama supporter, someone who, did a lot of work in 2008. And he was a friend of hers, and he also was a very big Obama supporter, knocked on doors in Nevada, came up, actually created a club called the Yes We Can Democratic Club. I mean, this was definitely someone who was a partisan Obama fan. And one day, apropos of nothing, we're just kind of discussing things on email, and I get a contact from him, and he says, how come Obama's mortgage plan that's supposed to help stop foreclosures ends up making your financial situation worse? And I said, well, what are you talking about? And at that time, this was like 2009, maybe 2010, I wasn't entirely sure what he was talking about. And so I asked him, well, what do you mean? And we ended up hooking up on the phone, and we had this discussion. He tells me this horror story about the program to mitigate foreclosures, which is called the Home Affordable Modification Program, or HAM, and how he ended up essentially being tricked by his mortgage company, who he put in a application to get a lower, a mortgage modification through HAM, and they gave him a trial run for several months. It was only supposed to be 3 months under the rules of HAMP. It was only supposed to be 3 months of trial payments and then converted into a permanent modification, but they left him hanging for close to a year and then said, we deny you, and oh, by the way, you owe us the balance between that modified payment we gave you and the original payment, and you owe it to us in 30 days or we're going to take your home away. And this was, as I learned, because I solicited other stories, a very common technique that banks, mortgage companies were essentially using the HAMP program to enrich themselves at the expense of their borrowers. And so that got me sort of looking into the mortgage servicing industry, the entire architecture of foreclosures, and figuring out what was happening on that side of it. And as I was doing that, this concept of foreclosure fraud sort of came to the fore, and I started writing about that. At the time, I was writing for a website called Firedog Lake, where I was doing a lot of news for them, and this was something that a lot of people weren't paying attention to, but I thought it was critically important. You're talking about the most important financial transaction of a person's adult life, and there was this huge problem, particularly in states like Florida and California, of millions of people going, losing their homes, going bankrupt. It wasn't really getting the kind of coverage that I thought it should have gotten. And so after my friends sort of gave me this knowledge of it, I really started to pay attention to it, and that led me to hear about these three amazing people in South Florida, right in Palm Beach, actually, where you are, who were, played a significant role in uncovering this whole other aspect of it, which my friend wasn't really even aware of or talking about. But the fact that the paperwork that was being used to evict and dispossess people of their homes was also all fraudulent for various reasons. And these individuals, along with defense lawyers and people who were fighting this at the activist level, were really the ones who got this going and got people to pay attention, such that at the end of 2010, all the major mortgage companies in America stopped foreclosing on people because they couldn't do it anymore legally. They were mass fabricating these documents to make it look like they had rightful ownership of these mortgages and the ability to foreclose, when in fact they did not. And these things had forgeries, they had backdating, they had all sorts of problems, the documentation, and it was very obvious, actually. These people were dedicated, and they really tracked down all this evidence and came up with just a mountain of clear evidence of this misconduct. But it wasn't really that hard to spot. There's a passage in my book where Lynn Simoniak, one of the three subjects that I profile, comes upon a mortgage document that purports to assign a mortgage, which is what you do when you do a transfer of ownership, assign the mortgage to an entity that had the name bogus assignee. And what was going on is that was a placeholder at this mass document fabrication shop that was putting these things together very quickly, and people just didn't change out who the actual assignee was supposed to be, whether a bank or some other mortgage company, and they just left in the placeholder of bogus assignee. And there were dozens of these in the public records, and actual foreclosure cases were happening based on somebody really looking at this evidence and awarding the mortgage, even though the underlying evidence said bogus assignee. So it's not like it was hard to spot, but it was just overlooked by so many people unless you were in it, unless you were a foreclosure victim, unless you were a foreclosure attorney. You just weren't aware of this happening. And thanks in large part to the work of people like Lisa Epstein and Lynn Smoniak and Michael Redman, we actually learned about this and what was going on, and I thought that was critically important, and wanted to tell the story, sort of roll it back all the way from the beginning to see how they got involved and how they executed.
You know, this foreclosure fraud is going around in all 50 states in the country. What brought you specifically to Lake Worth, Florida, where most of your book takes place?
Right, so that's where these three individuals happen to live. I really wanted to tell this story through the eyes of foreclosure victims. I thought that they were criminally underrepresented in the public policy debate around foreclosures, and I thought that we had to sort of honor their struggle, and particularly these three people who found these irregularities in their own cases and didn't stop there. They decided that they wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves, and they started to look through the public records and organize on a much broader level than just fighting their own cases. And in doing so, they put up websites that all of them sort of had a different spin, but they were all intended to get the word out about this mass crime happening in the mortgage industry. And I was attracted and drawn to them because they were sources of mine. I would read their websites to find out the latest information about what was going on. And around the end of 2010, shortly after the mass sort of moratorium that was put on de facto by the banking industry, there was this meeting in Washington. I describe it in the book, and I was at that meeting, and that was the first time that I met Lisa and Michael and Lynn. And even before that, I was reading their websites to get information about what was happening. So after that, after I actually met them, they became sources of mine who I would reach out to if I had questions or wanted to learn more about a particular thing that they put on their site. And then sort of when it all ended, I felt like their story needed to be uplifted, that it was a perfect example of what happened over the course of the financial crisis and its aftermath, where people who worked hard, tried to go up against this massively powerful industry, ended up coming up short, and the people who perpetrated this major crime ended up getting away with it. And I thought no better way was there to explain that and demonstrate that than through the story of these three people. And it just so happens that they were based in Florida. I think there is a reason that it happened to be Florida that was ground zero of this thing. We know that about half of all subprime mortgages in the key peak years of the crisis came from 4 states: Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and California. And Nevada, Arizona, and California are different in that you don't actually need a judge's order in order to foreclose. They have what is called a non-judicial foreclosure process, and it involves posting notice, using trustees to execute the foreclosure sale. It's just a different process, and it doesn't have as much evidence attached to it. Only in Florida, among these 4 heavy foreclosure states, was there this requirement that the bank, if they wanted to foreclose, had to go to court and get a judgment. And because they had to get a judgment, they had to introduce evidence. And because they had to introduce evidence, that evidence was publicly available. And these 3 individuals exploited that by going and finding the evidence and showing it to be fraudulent. So that's why I think this only really could have started in Florida, and ultimately that's what happened.
So your book is called Chain of Title. What made you name it that way?
Yeah, so chain of title refers to the chain of ownership that is supposed to govern all property transactions. You are, as a property owner, supposed to be able to go into your county office, your recording office, and look at the unbroken chain of ownership, or the chain of title, the title to your house, all the way back from when it was built until the present day. It should say that Mr. X bought it, and he sold it to Mr. Y, and then after 30 years, he sold it to Mr. Z, and 40 years later, Mr. Q got it, and then you got it. And that's supposed to be an unbroken chain. And what happened in the crisis is through this process of creating these mortgage-backed securities where the investment banks would buy these mortgages up, package them in securities, and sell them all around the world, there were all these secondary steps that they had to take to maintain that chain of title, that chain of ownership, and that's precisely what they did not do. They lost the unbroken chain. They broke links in the chain of title, and when they had to go foreclose later, they didn't have the proper evidentiary record to back that up, and so what they did is they fudged it. They created this fabrication of documents in order to cover up the fact that they broke chain of title in various ways, and described in the book. It gets a little technical, but the point is that chain of title was really at the heart of what this crime was all about. The mortgage industry broke the ownership chain on millions and millions of homes and then used false evidence to execute foreclosures in court. There is no other set of court proceedings where false evidence would be allowable to be brought into a court and used to convict. There's no way that you, if you were prosecuting grand theft or murder case, that you could get away with using false evidence and still win your case. That's what happened on a mass industrial scale during and after the foreclosure crisis. And for those who say, well, that individual wasn't paying on their house, so it's justified, whatever the bank had to do, as long as they were owed money and didn't get it, then it's okay. That really just, it does violence, I think, to the entire judicial system as a whole. It's like saying that, well, we know that murder suspect was guilty, so it's okay if the cops plant a gun on him and fabricate the evidence. Evidence is at the bedrock of our judicial system. Anytime that you allow something, a piece of false evidence to go in, you are undermining the integrity of the very justice system itself. And that's what happened. And sadly, it really hasn't been fixed.
So, in your book, you talk about Florida's Attorney General Pam Bondi, and you're not much of a fan of her by all means, I guess would be putting it lightly. Can you explain exactly where that comes from?
Right. In the book, I tell the story of two career attorneys at the Florida Attorney General's office, Teresa Edwards and June Clarkson. And Edwards and Clarkson were really the first public officials to really pick up on this concept of foreclosure fraud and to really demonstrate what was going on. They used, like I did, Lisa and Lynn and Michael as sources and put together presentations and subpoenaed documents showing exactly what was going on with these mass document fabrication and this false evidence being used to execute foreclosure cases. And that was true right through the end of 2010. And, of course, in the 2010 midterm elections, Pam Bondi gets elected as Attorney General. And almost immediately, June Clarkson and Teresa Edwards are essentially thrown off the case. They are told that they cannot do the subpoenas that they were previously issuing. They are told that they are too heated, that they are told that their desks are messy. They are told that they are too pushy and aggressive toward these foreclosure law firms and the other defendants or suspects that they are investigating. And ultimately, they're fired. This comes a year or so down the line, but ultimately, they are fired and taken completely out of the case when they were the first real public officials who were investigating this misconduct. And when Bondi was asked why these people were fired, an investigation was conducted that was basically a whitewash investigation that accused Lisa and Lynn of essentially, brainwashing June Clarkson and Teresa Edwards and throwing information at them in a way to get a free house. That was how it was depicted in this Inspector General report. So Bondi, through her actions, really showed that she had the backs of the mortgage companies and the foreclosure machinery down in Florida, and ultimately she made sure that those companies got away with very minimal fines or no fines in some cases. and the investigations were essentially closed. So that was one of the most promising areas in which this misconduct could have been rooted out and really demonstrated in a law enforcement context on a broad scale. And Bondi was instrumental in shutting that down.
Now, Bondi took over for Attorney General Bill McCollum. And in your book, you mentioned Bill McCollum was taking this seriously.
He was kind of. And part of that had to do with the fact that he was running for governor at the time. And politically speaking, in 2010, if you were running a case of going tough on the banking industry, you were probably in a pretty good position. McCollum was running this primary against Rick Scott, and he was using the Clarkson and Edwards investigation to show his consumer protection bona fides and trying to use that as a way to attract vote. Ultimately, he wasn't successful while he let June Clarkson and Teresa Edwards continue their investigation. When he left, obviously it fell to Pam Bondi to governing those decisions, and she made a completely different call.
I just want to circle back for a minute. These two people that were working in the Attorney General, you're saying that they got in trouble for having messy desks?
that was one of the things that was in the Inspector General's report. And what's interesting about that is the reason they had quote-unquote messy desks is that they were getting inundated with documents, people's own foreclosure documents that were sending in from all over the country as examples of this misconduct. As I said, it was really on an industrial scale. You're talking about millions and millions of fabricated documents, and all these foreclosure victims were getting them and seeing the problem in their own cases. And when Clarkson and Edwards were sort of publicized as the first and only public officials who were looking into this, people started just steamrolling them with all these documents. And so these documents were littered all around their office because it was such a massive scandal. And then that was used against Clarkson and Edwards in the Inspector General report justifying their firing.
Jesus. Wow. That's kind of interesting there, I'd say the least. So, to move this forward, has anyone ever been held criminally liable for all this that happened, all this fraud?
Well, there's one person who was ever convicted and served time in jail for foreclosure fraud, and her name is Lorraine Brown. And Lorraine Brown was the head of one of these document fabrication companies. It was called DocX. And she was hired by mortgage companies to mass fabricate these documents. She had authorized one of the employees at DocX named Linda Green to be authorized as the vice president of over 20 different banks. I call her the lowest paid bank vice president in history because she had this signing authority or alleged signing authority for 20 different banks. And they had to speed up this assembly line to mass produce these documents so fast that they would let anybody in the office sign the name Linda Green. And when they asked afterwards, well, why did you choose Linda Green? Why was she the woman who was made the vice president of all these different banks? They said, well, you know, her name is easy to spell. So for our $10 an hour employees, it was easy to have Linda Green be one person whose name everybody could sign. But, of course, then none of them signed it the same way. They all signed it in their own handwriting. And so in the public records, there's this name Linda Green through these DocX documents, signing as the vice president of all these different banks in 20 different styles of handwriting. So it was very obvious. And ultimately what Lorraine Brown was arrested and convicted for was lying to the FBI about the scheme to mass fabricate and forge documents. She ended up getting, I believe, 4 years in prison, first in Michigan, and then it was sort of a joint matter of the Michigan Attorney General and the Federal Justice Department. Then she got paroled from the Michigan case. She moved down, I believe, in Florida, and she's due to be released, I believe, this summer. And she still serves as the only person. But what's really interesting about her case is they said that she was guilty of a conspiracy to fabricate these documents. But it was a conspiracy of one. In the charging document, it said that Lorraine Brown did this unbeknownst to her clients, as if her clients, who were these major banks, didn't know that she was going to fabricate these documents when they asked for documents to prove ownership that they no longer had. It's a ludicrous situation. She was, you know, if you're familiar with Lindy England, she was the low-level Abu Ghraib army private that was blamed for all of the misconduct in the torture scandal at Abu Ghraib, Lorraine Brown was the Lindy England of the foreclosure fraud scandal. She was singled out as the one person who did something wrong as a way to immunize the executives of the largest banks and whoever it was who directed the scheme to get all of these millions of documents into the public record.
I want to switch this back up over to the national level. You've been consistently critical of the Obama administration, and more specifically, our former Attorney General, Eric Holder, for their handling of the crisis. Where did that exactly come from?
Well, the Obama administration did a very poor job of mitigating the worst effects of the foreclosure crisis. And I think what Chain of Title shows, the book shows, is that they had the opportunity to really get a better outcome for millions and millions of homeowners. They had this legal exposure on the part of the largest mortgage companies in America, the largest banks in America, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, were all massively legally exposed by this. And they could have used that as leverage to improve the outcomes so that we didn't have 10 million families lose their homes, so that we didn't have millions of families underwater on their mortgages, so that we didn't have elevated unemployment for years and years and years after the crisis. And they just didn't do it. And when they didn't, they really corrupted the nature of our justice system in the exchange. You know, Eric Holder famously, in sort of an unrelated case around HSBC, the term was coined too big to jail, that he believed that these banks were so large that actually trying to hold them accountable for their own conduct would create these unintended consequences and hurt the broader economy. That was the mentality of the Obama administration really throughout its two terms when it came to this particular issue. And I think it was really a toxic situation that, in its own way, led to the rise of a Donald Trump. You ended up creating a two-tiered system of justice where who you are mattered more than what you did. And people saw that. They saw that the banking industry was essentially untouchable when it came to the justice system. And they ended up, thinking that the system was rigged and foul, and they ended up turning to a demagogue. If the system is completely screwed up, then you start thinking in ways that you might not otherwise as to who might be able to fix it. And obviously that was mistaken. But at some level, you have to see the inability to conduct real accountability as a signature kind of mechanism that led to the rise of Donald Trump. And so that critique holds. And of course, Eric Holder, who worked at Covington and Burling, which was a major defense firm for big banks, almost all the big banks, then became Attorney General, started negotiating with those big banks over this massive misconduct. During that time, Covington Burling puts together their new building in Washington, holds a corner office open for Eric Holder for when he will come back to the firm after he finishes his Attorney General tenure. And that's happening while he's negotiating with Covington and Burling clients. And then he does leave the Attorney General's office and go immediately back to Covington and Burling. I mean, this, we talk a lot about these scandals, whether you're talking about Scott Pruitt or Tom Price or all of these swamp creatures in the Trump cabinet. That was a major, major scandal. When you have the Attorney General of the United States negotiating with clients of a large law firm that he then goes back to that was holding open a corner office for him while he was doing the negotiating. There's this idea out there that there were no major scandals in the Obama administration. That's a major scandal, and it had wide-reaching effects.
Our Treasury Secretary, he had an involvement in the foreclosure fraud, did he not?
The current Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, was the chairman of One West Bank. One West Bank was one of the mortgage servicing companies that certainly participated in foreclosure fraud. There is a deposition from a vice president of One West Bank that explains that she would sign something like 700 affidavits a week attesting to the truthfulness of underlying foreclosure documents. And they asked her how long she spent on each of these documents after the basis of signing the affidavit. And she said, well, I've shortened my signature, so now it takes 30 seconds. So she spent 30 seconds looking into the truthfulness of these documents that were used to take people's home away. And what that is known as is robo-signing. And that's when individuals would sign sort of robotically these affidavits that were legal documents swearing that everything in a foreclosure file was true and correct. And it turns out they were mass fabricated documents. So One West engaged in that misconduct. Among other things, there was a leaked document from the California Attorney General's office in 2013 that I reported on a few years later that accused One West Bank of widespread misconduct in the foreclosure sales process in California. Ultimately, the then Attorney General, Kamala Harris, decided not to prosecute One West Bank for that misconduct, but it paints a pretty vivid picture of what they were doing. So yes, was Mnuchin heavily involved in that? He sure was, and also he got several of his buddies into the government. Joseph Otting, who is the head of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is a major bank regulator, also was from One West Bank. He was a CEO of One West Bank. So Mnuchin was briefly the CEO, then he handed it over to Otting. One West Bank was since sold to another bank called CIT. So every CEO in the history of One West Bank, this crooked bank, is now in the government engaging in regulation of the banking industry.
In the Obama administration, to address the financial crisis, they created the Dodd-Frank Act, which famously contained in the Dodd-Frank Act created CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What exactly does the CFPB do, and do you know who came up with the idea for it?
Well, you have to split it between what was it intended to do and what does it do today. What it was intended to do when it was created by then Harvard professor Elizabeth Warren, now Senator Elizabeth Warren, was it was intended to be to mortgages and financial products what the Consumer Product Safety Commission is to toasters. That it would be an agency that was committed to consumer protection on financial transactions, whether you're talking about bank accounts or credit cards or mortgages or payday loans or whatever major financial transaction there is. This would be an agency that would conduct oversight, enforcement, to keep the banks honest. And what it really did was it aggregated these consumer protection priorities, which were at various other parts of the regulatory structure, but it wasn't their main role, right? So the Federal Reserve had some consumer protection oversight, but that wasn't its main goal. They were really thinking about the safety and soundness of the banking system, and as a sidelight, they would also have these consumer protection priorities. This was an agency that had as its main and only mission protecting consumers. And for the first 5 or so years of its life, that's what it did. It restored about $12 billion in ill-gotten gains from the financial industry back to the people. It engaged in major investigations of pretty much all of the major big banks and significant misconduct. It didn't have criminal enforcement authority. It would refer people up to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution. We've already talked about how that went. But for the first 5 years, in terms of what it was supposed to do, I think the CFPB did a good job. Now, last November, the initial director of the CFPB, Richard Cordray, left the agency and was replaced by Nick Mulvaney, who is the head of the Office of Management and Budget and who moonlights as the alleged acting director of the CFPB. And under his leadership, or so-called leadership, almost nothing has happened at CFPB, and the agency has been crippled and sort of undermined under his leadership. The ultimate structure is still there, but they don't engage in a lot of enforcement. A lot of the rulemaking that they did to increase disclosure, to ban certain practices. A lot of that has been rolled back, and certainly a less functional agency today than it was when it was initially put in, and in terms of what it was intended to do. That said, I still think it is an important development that we streamline the regulatory apparatus so we centralize consumer protection in one agency, and future presidencies hopefully will restore the ability for that agency to actually look out for the public.
What beef does Mick Mulvaney exactly have with Elizabeth Warren? It seems like he's dead set on taunting her. Where's that stem from?
Yeah, I think Mick Mulvaney made it pretty clear when he spoke in front of Banking Association. He said that he wouldn't talk to anyone in his office unless they gave money to his campaign. He has been bought and paid for by the financial industry throughout his career, even before well before he got into the Trump administration. He was a congressman, is a well-paid servant of the lending industry and the banking industry. And, of course, Elizabeth Warren is the opposite of that. And this was her baby. This was really the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren. And so he spares no opportunity to, as you say, taunt her about the fact that he has essentially destroyed, at least for the time being, this agency that she worked so hard to stand up.
If the next leader of the CFPB is confirmed, can the next president or Congress remove them from office and nominate somebody else instead?
So the way CFPB works is that the director gets a 5-year term, and that 5 years doesn't necessarily match up with terms of a president. So right now, Mulvaney is the acting director. President Trump has nominated somebody to be the permanent director. And if and when that permanent director is placed, let's say it happens, on August 1st, I'm not saying it will, but let's say it happens August 1st, 2018, that individual would have a 5-year term until as late as August 1st, 2023 to serve. And that's true whether or not President Trump gets reelected. So you could see a situation where a Democrat is elected in 2020, and for a couple years of his or her term, there would be this other individual who was nominated by President Trump running the CFPB. And in fact, this is kind of the reason why Mick Mulvaney was installed and then left there with a major delay for the person who was ultimately nominated to be the director. By doing so, you extended the amount of time that Trump or a Trump nominee would have dominion, sort of, or agency over the CFPB. So it was really a concerted effort to elongate that time frame, and it's going to be, if there is a Democratic president who wins in 2020, it's going to be a serious issue that their top consumer protection agency for financial transactions is not going to be on the same page. And, we saw that sort of in the first year of the Trump administration when Richard Cordray was still doing his work, even though President Trump was sort of ideologically opposed to that work. Well, the tables are going to be turned if there is a Democratic win in 2020. So
the CFPB is basically, the Congress' only role is nominating the director, and then the director is pretty much untouchable while they finish their term?
The president nominates the director. The Congress has the role of advising consent. So the Senate confirms the nominee. After that, there's a 5-year term. The whole idea of CFPB was to insulate it from politics. So the idea was to not make it something where it's a political appointment that goes in and goes out depending on the change in power in the White House. So a lot of things in the structure of CFPB are put together that way so that they're insulated. The budget of CFPB, for example, comes from the Federal Reserve's budget rather than being appropriated, and that protects it from being sort of strangled by congressional appropriators who then just sort of give it no money to actually perform its operations. So the head of the CFPB, I believe, can be let go by the president only for cause, and that would be some sort of dereliction of duty or something. But otherwise, the director of the agency has the ability to stay in office for the duration of that 5-year term much like other agencies, there's FDIC also has a 5-year term, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which I mentioned, has a set term that is not tied to what president is in the White House. So it's not totally uncommon, but certainly it's going to become an issue if there is a Democratic president in 2020, because Kathy Kraninger, who's the nominee, or whoever ends up becoming the director of CFPB, is certainly not going to have the same perspective as a Democratic president.
I thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Oz.